Dark Souls is not a difficult video game, or even a particularly good one, but for whatever reason, it has gained a reputation as being one of the hardest video games out there, spawning a number of middling sequels that people love to pretend are masterpieces. There is a lot to be said about Dark Souls, but I think the most important thing at this stage is for those of you who aren't particularly educated on the topic, yes, there are several games far harder than Dark Souls. And today, I would like to present you 10 examples of video games on Nintendo consoles that are far more difficult and much better than any Dark Souls game or spin-off or derivative like other From Slot property out there. These are the top 10 games harder than Dark Souls. Let's get the obvious entry out of the way first. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze made it into the news cycle recently when Dark Souls streamers started breaking down in tears upon trying to stream this because this game, despite its looks as a colorful, kid-friendly Nintendo game, is actually fairly difficult. Bosses are far more challenging than they are in most platformers. The level design is vast and elaborate, with each stage having its own unique gimmicks. There, even skilled players can get stuck in a lot of these challenges doing them over and over and over again, and simply beating stages is not enough because of all the collecting you have to do, all the secrets exits you have to find, and all the puzzle pieces there are to collect, right? Like, this is a 10 out of 10 platformer in general, but the difficulty is something that I think a lot of people sleep on when talking about this franchise as a whole, because ever since Donkey Kong Country 2, Donkey Kong Country has been this very brutal Nintendo platforming series. It's kind of had a reputation for that among fans, and I, having played both, can safely say that this specific entry and Donkey Kong Country 2 are far more difficult than any of the Dark Souls games. A pleb might tell you that Devil May Cry is way harder than Dark Souls, but the reality is that Ninja Gaiden is better than both. The greatest action game franchise out there, Ninja Gaiden leapt onto Nintendo Switch some time ago, and it shocked players with its intense difficulty, its well-balanced combat, and its gorgeous visuals. This game is an absolute beast, and is one that I would recommend to any hardcore action game fan. Just be sure you pick up the Xbox original versions of these games. But when you look at what Ninja Gaiden has able to accomplish this year, over the years, when you look at its legacy, that there is no denying that this is a series that has stood the test of time, right? This game and its legacy of having difficult, challenging games goes back all the way to the NES, and that is something that I wish more people looked back on fondly. One of the most slept on games on 3DS, Kid Icarus Uprising is known for being a monumental achievement in video games, bringing back Kid Icarus in a glorious fashion. This entry manages to balance easy pick up the play like combat with just this intense sense of replayability, insane unlockables, and self-imposed challenges. Much like the Super Smash Bros. Series, this game has a really robust achievement system that will keep you coming back time and time and time again. 100% completing this game is an absolute nightmare, but if you can manage it, you are one of the greatest gamers in the world. This game is monumental, and I wish more people understood just how great it actually is. This may shock some people, but if you actually compare the Zelda games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, to Dark Souls, you will find that, objectively speaking, Zelda is harder. There is better enemy AI. There are more combat options. There's more flexibility in what you can do. There are all different strategies you can take to approach enemies. And what's more, they can wallop you far easier, right? Like, it's crazy to think that in my 70-hour playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom, I never once tried to fight a Gleeok because it was far beyond my capabilities, as opposed to 70 hours of Dark Souls where you essentially have done everything you can do several times. Like, when you look at just the sheer scope of these games and everything you have to do to become, the true hero of legend, like, you're left with an absolute monumental just achievement in adventure, open world adventure games. This is something that I think a lot of people don't really understand about these games is that they are very, very difficult. They are something that most people have to overcome and have to get good at and have to learn how to play. And that I think is I think this game has a far better presentation and just all around difficulty balance than Dark Souls. As opposed to Dark Souls, which tries to trick you into thinking it's much harder than it actually is, Zelda is very elusive about its difficulty, right? You're not going to get in trouble unless you allow yourself to get into trouble. You can avoid dangerous situations, and I think a lot of people tend to get this impression that makes the game easier than it actually is. But in reality, it's going to take you significantly more time and effort to get anywhere in this game than it would take to get through all of the Dark Souls adventures. The greatest superhero story ever told is also exceedingly difficult. This isn't a game that a lot of people talk about anymore, but if you actually look and see like what the Wonderful 101 is like, when you see how it was received, when you see what it takes to like do everything there is to do in this game, when you see how much thought it takes to approach every single situation, how flexible the combat is, all the things you can do, all the combos you can unleash, all the strategies you can unleash against your enemies, all the powers you can unlock, like it all just comes together to make one of the most elaborate, like esoteric action games ever made. Right? This game does not get the credit it deserves because I do think this is, objectively speaking, one of the best action games ever produced. It is a monumental achievement in video games, and it's shocking to me that more people don't really appreciate it as such. This game, I think, more than anything, kind of proves that truly difficult games, as opposed to that plebeian Dark Souls stuff, will simply get ignored by the public, right? Because nobody will know how to play or beat them. But this game, if you can get through it, if you can experience this masterpiece for yourself, you'll understand its difficult. Its difficulty. You'll understand its appeal. You'll understand what it's accomplishing, and you'll have undying respect for it and its creators. This is one of the best games ever produced, and I wish more people acknowledged it as such. There are quite a few video games that I would say basically does Dark Souls but better. But I think Monster Hunter takes the crown in that respect because it's everything people say they like about Souls games. You have the crazy elaborate bosses, you have the environments, you have all of that. Like it's simply a more structured Souls game, right? There is no open environment, there is nothing. It's just you and the monster. And because of the design, because of the philosophy of these games, it could not be more apparent that Monster Hunter is far, far more hardcore than Souls games. Like the average monster, right? The stuff you fight at the beginning of the game is probably more difficult and challenging than anything you'll fight in any Souls game ever, right? These things have incredible patterns, crazy attacks, unbelievable animations, and it just all comes together in just this stellar experience when you're playing a Nintendo exclusive version of the game, right? Unfortunately, like recent releases like World and its sequel seem like have really stripped down the hardcore nature of it, and it's become exceedingly casualized. But the Nintendo ones are still great. When you look at what Monster Hunter is and how it presents itself, like how much time you can put into like a single one of these games, like you'll understand that this game is something that stands heads and shoulders above anything that FromSlop has ever produced. Monster Hunter is phenomenal, and I hope the series continues to see continued success on Nintendo hardware. It's Ghosts and Goblins. Do I need to say anything more? Apparently I do, because apparently there are people in my audience who are too young to know what anything before a GameCube is. Like Ghosts and Goblins, what's that? Well, Ghosts and Goblins is basically what Dark Souls pretends it is, right? An extremely hardcore dark fantasy action game. Right, but whereas Dark Souls, you can easily cheese the entire thing with like the Zweihander, you get it right at the beginning of the game. Like Ghosts and Goblins is much more brutal, right? Where two hits is all it takes for you to be taken out and taken back to the last checkpoint, right? You have unlimited continues, but the game is so brutal that you won't even notice. The game is so brutal that it's extremely difficult to get through, especially if you don't know what you're doing. Of course, there are strategies you can use and things you need to know about going through the game, like the infamous ending, for example. But I think for someone who's going into this game for the first time with no knowledge whatsoever, like the same way that Dark Souls fans experience Dark Souls for the first time, right? Like, I think it will be apparent that Ghosts and Goblins is far more difficult. It's really not even close. One of the best indie releases of recent years, Hollow Knight took what Dark Souls did and made it actually competent. A dark fantasy setting with fun, interesting characters and a great gameplay loop, Hollow Knight sticks out among the vast array of Dark Souls clones out there by actually daring to be its own thing, with great visuals, intense combat situations, and an insane difficulty curve. Hollow Knight is a spectacular game even without all of its additions that make it far more difficult than Dark Souls. Right? For a Dark Souls fans, blitzing through the entire game and taking out every boss is just something that is a self-imposed challenge run. But in Hollow Knight, it is a requirement to get the true final secret ending, right? In order to beat Hollow Knight, which to truly beat Hollow Knight, which most people have not done and will never do, you have to beat every single boss in the game, something like 40 plus, 48 I think. 48 bosses in a single gauntlet. Some of them have super powered forms that you've never seen before, right? Like beating Hollow Knight is an absolute nightmare. But if you do it, you'll have beaten one of the hardest games out there. Something that is far, far more difficult than Dark Souls. What could be possibly more terrifying than being trapped in a ball and being forced to roll down an elaborate obstacle course? Like, forget the whole first flame thing and the kiln and everything that happened in the first Dark Souls game. Like, this is way more horrifying. Just look at this. Look at these monkeys just endlessly getting into these dangerous situations with no end in sight. It's horrifying, right? And that's before you even play the game. And once you start playing Super Monkey Ball, specifically the first one, once you start playing the original game, once you start experiencing Monkey Ball, it's not even it won't even be by the time you get to the end of the game, right? Usually by the time you get to advanced, the normal difficulty stage, you'll start realizing that this game, it's a nightmare. Playing this game, it's one of the most brutal things I've ever gone through, right? And it's true, right? Monkey Ball is brutal. For sure. You'll be dying hundreds or thousands of times trying to beat some of these courses. I think some of the later ones in this version of the game, Banana Mania, it took me hours to get the hang of them and figure out how to get past them. And even now, there are a handful that I can't do consistently, right? It takes an insane amount of skill to beat Super Monkey Ball, right? More skill than anything in Dark Souls, really. It's really not even close. The only way you would think Dark Souls is more difficult is if you hadn't played Monkey Ball ever. It's interesting that Nintendo produced Zelda II, which is essentially a prototype of Dark Souls, and then said to themselves, yeah, this game is disappointing. Let's never produce anything like it ever again. So they produced A Link to the Past, they produced Link's Awakening, they produced Ocarina, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, the Oracle games, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, A Link Between Worlds, Tears of the Kingdom, and never looked back, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Zelda 2 has a lot of problems, right? It's slow, it's boring, the RPG mechanics don't make any sense, the combat is dull and uninspired, right? The world structure is stupid. When you look at Zelda 2, you just see a complete mess. But you also basically see the template for what Dark Souls would eventually become, right? That has always been my take on the Dark Souls games, is that they're just very poorly made spiritual successors to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. And for me, I would rather just play the iconic original.